speaker today. Okay, so our speaker today is creative coach Paige Baldwin Ando. And Paige lives in Tokyo, but coaches people from all over the world. About 2 months ago, I took the workshop with her, and partly because I realized that I hadn't considered the concept of creativity for a very, very long time, and that there was probably a lot more that I could learn about it. So, and the approaches that Paige teaches, I think, can be applied to probably all areas of life. I know that procrastination is my expertise, and it particularly hits me when I deal with like official and financial things. And Paige's advice has helped me feel more positive and capable, even dealing with those things. So I hope today's event proves fruitful for everyone. Let me hand over to our coach, Paige. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you all for having me. I really appreciate being here. And it's just so lovely to see your faces. And it's been a long time since I've been in any kind of group, even a Zoom group of this size. So I'm just so happy to be here. Thank you for having me. I would like to share my screen so I can share with you what I have got here for you. Can everybody see that okay? Was that good? Okay, great. So yeah, I introduced myself a little bit before we started, but I'd like to just do that again because some of you weren't yet here. I am Paige, and I've been in Japan since 2003. I came here with the intention of staying just a couple of years, and lo and behold, it's almost 2 decades later. And I love living in Japan. I'm so grateful for the tremendously creative environment that we all live in. I love being surrounded by the creativity of this culture and the language, and I just feel inspired by it. I do feel inspired by it every day. So I'm really grateful for that. I'm a writer like all of you. I've written and edited professionally for many years. And in my own personal work, I tend to focus more on essays and memoir type work. That is my passion creatively. I've worked as a creativity coach since 2012, and I started in that because I found myself coming up against my own creative blocks. And at the beginning, most of that was related to time. In 2012, I still had 2 very small children, and I had a really hard time finding time to do what I wanted to do. And in working through my own creative blocks, I discovered creativity coaching, and I just really love this work. I've worked with people from around the world, and basically what the work is helping people to find what their own specific needs are creatively, because we all have different creative needs. And very often if we read a book or or listen to a podcast or whatever, we're getting advice that's quite prescriptive about creativity. But what tends to work better for most people, for all people in my experience, is to find what specifically works for you and your own creative needs, your own creative basically terrain. I think of it as like an internal terrain, who we are creatively. So I've helped clients do things like begin novels they've been thinking about for a decade, finish novels they've been working on for a decade, launch blogs, even launch businesses, take up projects that they haven't touched in years, all kinds of things like that. That is more about me and what I do. So yeah, I would like to move on to the topic for today, which is of containers. And this is an interesting word to associate with creativity because I don't think it's something we very often do. But containers are basically ways that you can support yourself and your creative process. Because writing is something that combines the analytical mind and sort of that flowy space that we get into sometimes when things are going really well. Creative blocks for writers tend to be quite persnickety and difficult to navigate. We have a little bit of a hard time with things like procrastination or things like perfectionism or all kinds of things that can get into play when we are in our analytical mind. So I'll talk quite a bit more about this today and how containers can help you. So what is a container? It's basically any structure that helps you organize and support your work. And I'll give you substantially more examples in just a moment. But just to begin with, I'd like you to note that, again, containers themselves, the containers you use for yourself, are highly individual. Whatever you choose to work with is highly individual. And you will find as you move through this process today that working with what works for you will be, I hope, liberating and freeing for you to find, okay, this is what works for me, as opposed to what I've heard or what I've read or what I think other people think would be good for me. Finding the containers that really do organize and support your work is incredibly powerful. So here are some examples of containers, and this is far from an exhaustive list. It's not exhaustive at all, but these are some examples of things that can be containers for you to support you, support your work, and support your ultimate goal, whatever that may be. You can have a temporal container. That would be time that you put aside to work, or it could also be times of day that you work best. Let's say, for example, you know that when you wake up at 6 o'clock or 5 o'clock and you get up before the rest of the household and there's that quiet in the morning, that's when things flow for you. Or it might be that you need to stay up until 1 a.m. to do that. Or it might be that you really need to have some exercise before you have your chunk of time that you work. Any kind of container that is related to time that you know is helpful for you can be very useful when it comes to your creative work. A container could be physical. It could be a space where you do your work, a room, or even just a table. I know for many of us living in Japan, we don't necessarily have a ton of space, do we? So it could be just your own little corner. I used to have, I don't have it anymore, but one of those like little folding tables, that you get in Japan, that I would just have that folding table as my physical space where I knew when I bring this out, okay, now I'm going to work on my writing. A container could be conceptual or thematic. Like, for example, it could be a theme for a series that you're writing. Maybe you're writing a, science fiction trilogy, or it could be the subject of an essay. I tend to have thematic containers of working with themes related to my family. I really love working with the theme of family. And when I know that, it helps me to kind of organize what I want to do and how I want to think about my work. It could also be, a container could also be numerical. Years ago, I used to write 500-word pieces. And knowing that I had this container of 500 words gave me a sense of like, oh, okay, here are my limits, here are my edges, here's what I'd like to do with this information today. And it kind of gives you the opportunity to pour your creative energy into this shape of a container of 500 words. Or it could be the subject of an essay. Like, let's say that you're going to write about catching cicadas in summer in Japan. It could be that is enough to have as a container for you to feel some kind of limit or boundary for yourself to pour into. And speaking of boundaries, it could be boundary-based. A container could be letting your family know, as I did today. I asked my family, could you please be elsewhere while I teach this workshop? I love you. Could you please go away? That's a thing that we can use to help ourselves, to support ourselves in terms of writing. A boundary also could be making a promise to yourself. And when we do make these promises to ourselves, I do tend to recommend that they be very small so that they're easy to meet. I promise myself that I will sit down today in front of my computer and open it. I'll write one sentence today. Those kinds of small promises that you make to yourself can be exceptionally useful containers in terms of getting things done. Another type of container could be connected to rhythm or ritual. For many of us who are creative people, we tend to be kind of rebellious. Have you noticed that about yourself? Maybe we can have this rebellious quality to us where we don't like to be told what to do by other people. But at the same time, it is very useful for ourselves to notice what works for us in terms of a rhythm. Some people work exceptionally well in the morning. And after noon or 2 p.m., like the brain kind of starts to get a little fuzzy. Other people are the opposite. And once everybody else goes to bed, it's like their brain lights up. It can be any kind of rhythm related to your day or anything that works for you. I need to have my coffee first, or I need to go for a run first, or I need to, whatever it is that you notice works for you. This can be an extremely useful container for you. A container can also be project related. So like if you know, I have this project, you probably notice this with work, right? If you have a work project, you know, okay, then this is the deadline. I have this thing that I have to do. I'm going to work on this until it's done, essentially. That can be a really useful container. And lastly, again, this is not an exhaustive list, but it's just an example. You can have a relational container, like a group, like this one that you work in. People who get it, you know, people to whom you can say, oh, I'm up against this sticky writing problem, or, you know, I have this one issue, can you help me? People you can bounce it off of, because for many of us, we don't live with those people necessarily. You know, our family members are not necessarily the people who understand what it is we're doing and why we're doing it and how it goes. But to have this relational container of a group who gets you can be incredibly helpful as a way for you to think for yourself, what do I need and how can I get what I need? So with that in mind, again, this is not an exhaustive list. There can be all manner of containers that might work for you. And I'd like you to remember that when you're thinking of containers, again, to go back to that rebellious thing that sometimes comes to our minds as creative people, to remember that containers, because for many of us, if we think of a limit or a boundary or a container, we might go back to that part of our childhood where we were like, you know, people were telling us what to do and it didn't feel good, right? This is for you. Any container that you work with in your creative life now is for you. It is not anybody else coming in. It's not Stephen Pressfield or Stephen King or Julia Cameron. No one is coming in and telling you what you have to do for yourself. You get to decide. It's up to you. And they support you rather than constrict you. If we think of our creative flow as a liquid, containers are a vessel into which we can pour our creative energy and our creative work. And you are in control of how you use them. So again, like if I think of Julia Cameron, she says, well, writing morning pages is really good. You should write morning pages. Please write morning pages. You should have an artist date every week. That's great for people for whom it works. There are other people for whom that feels like a lot. You know, getting up and writing 3 pages immediately before you've had your coffee or before you've even really woken up seems like a lot. And going on an artist date is a lot. So I guess my main point is whoever you listen to in terms of creative advice and all of that, they have great ideas, you know, they really do. And you get to decide what works for you and what doesn't and how you use it. You're in control of your containers. So with that in mind, I would love to take a few minutes for all of us to just think of containers we've used in the past. They can be ones that worked for you or ones that didn't, any of them that you have tried, whether they worked or not, and just brainstorm a list of things you've tried. They could be containers in terms of time or space, genre, word count, or anything that's been significant to you in your work. For example, I know that in terms of space, if I try to go to a coffee shop and write, I find myself very distracted by the people around me because I tend to listen, or I'm noticing, oh, that person's having that kind of cake or whatever it is. I get distracted, but that's a thing I've tried. So for just a few minutes, let's make a list of the things that have worked, or whether they've worked or not, that we've tried as containers. And I'll be working along with you. Okay, now again, this really doesn't have to be an exhaustive list. It's just some examples of things you've tried. And the next step is that I would love to have you divide your page into columns, or the next page, whatever you've got available to you, of yes and no. What are some containers you can put on one side, containers that have worked for you, that you know are really, really useful on one side? And on the other side, equally important, are containers that have not worked for you. Because again, we do tend to get tons of writing advice from outside, don't we? There's all kinds of stuff that people say that we think, well, I should do that because so-and-so said that I should. It is equally important to know what doesn't work for you. One great example of this for me personally has been the advice that you very often hear of wake up at 5 a.m. You know, set your alarm for 5 a.m., get up and do the writing before anybody's awake. And I personally, that my brain isn't awake yet. My brain is not interested in working on something so cognitively heavy at that time of day. So that's great for me to know, because I don't keep pushing myself to do that once I know it. So let's take another few minutes and make this list for ourselves of yes and no. Okay. So with that in mind, with now we know we have a pretty solid grounding, or more solid than we had a few minutes ago, grounding in some things that work for us and some things that don't. I'd love to have you take the opportunity now to think about how to apply this information to your current project or the project that you'd like to work on. You could use any kind of container that you've discovered here on your yes list to think about, how could I use this in a deeper or more effective way to serve the project that I'm working on or the skill I'm working on right now? Okay. So I know that we had some questions that came up in the Facebook group, and I also know that many of you are working on your own projects and have some things that you might want to ask about. So I wanted to leave about half of our time for this specifically, for specific questions about issues that may come up during writing. And they could be about containers, which I hope was a useful tool for you, or they could be about anything else that has come up for you around your work, especially things that are persistent, because we do often find, because we all do have our own creative terrain internally, that we often come up against the same metaphorical geographical features of that creative terrain. That those might be perfectionism, getting overwhelmed, feeling like you don't have the time to do things, having a sense of just procrastination, whatever it is that you might find comes up for you. I wanted to give you all the opportunity to ask me specific questions and maybe even have a bit of coaching if you'd like to. So with that in mind, I will stop sharing and maybe open it up to questions. Yes. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Paige. Thanks so much. It's been great so far. Well, looking at those two themes, perfectionism and procrastination, perhaps things that apply to many people. Of course, again, it's a very individual thing, but have you in your work come across any particularly useful practical strategies? Okay, I'm going to go for procrastination, perhaps.
Okay.
I think they're very connected anyway, because if perfectionism is a stumbling block, then perhaps people do procrastinate because of the fear of not being perfect. So how might you address procrastination?
It's a great question. And it does often depend a lot on the specific circumstances of the procrastination for the individual person. Very often, you're totally right. When we're procrastinating, it's because there is some underlying fear there. And the fear is possibly of it not being perfect or it not looking like, we've all had this experience, right? We know what we want it to be. We have this image in our mind of like, this is how I want it to be. And whatever we put down is not that. There's not a match there. And very often there's this sense of like, like I wanted to have this very realistic, amazing thing, this world that I've created, and it looks like a stick figure of a giraffe. And I'm like, what have I done wrong here? And that fear of the gap between our internal image and the reality of what we're going to make is incredibly, it can be a huge obstacle for people. And so very often what I recommend for procrastination in particular is small steps. And when I say that, I mean so small that it's almost laughable. And I'll tell you why. Like, we are all wired biologically, our brains have the wiring of, there are different aspects of our brain, different parts of our brains. We have the front brain that tells us like, okay, here's how you're going to do it. Here's what you're going to do. It's logical, right? And it lays it out for us. We have a midbrain. And then we have the back part of our brain, the amygdala, which is the oldest part of any mammal's brain. And it gets scared very, very easily. It is incredibly easily frightened. And that is the part of the brain that's acting like, a dog trying to be taken for a walk that really doesn't want to go. It's like, you're not going to be able to pull it. That's the part of the brain that says, no, don't do anything we haven't done before because it's scary. Anything you're trying to do that is new, that aspect of your brain is going to try to stop you because it's built to keep you safe. It's built for your survival. That part of your brain is wired to keep you doing what it already knows, which is why you want to watch Netflix instead of do your writing, or why you want to even clean the kitchen sink. Sounds better than doing the writing because it's not dangerous for any part of you. But that part of your brain that's stopping you is the part that's just trying to protect you and keep you safe. Now, this is related to small steps, because if you take a small enough step, it's so small, especially if you think this is ridiculous, it's not going to work. That's the sign of a good small step, because you're thinking it's ridiculous, it's not going to work, means that the brain doesn't know to get scared of it. It's not big enough for your amygdala to think, stop, what are we doing? You know what I mean? If you tell yourself, I'm going to write 500 words a day, and you haven't been writing anything at all, right? 500 words a day is a lot. Can we agree on that? I think we could all agree. From 0 to 500 a day is a big leap. If you tell yourself, I'm going to open the computer and open up Scrivener and leave it, there's a part of your brain that's going to be like, well, that's stupid. That's not going to make any difference at all. That's good. Because it doesn't seem like it's anything. And then once your brain does realize, once the amygdala realizes, oh, nothing bad happened, then you can do the next step, whatever that is, write one sentence, or even just open up the file and leave it. The leaving it step is incredibly important when dealing with procrastination, because if we do try to force or push ourselves at that point, that is when the resistance starts to come up again, the fear starts to come up again. And we start to get like, okay, no, this is scary, this is bad, I'm going to put it away. Sometimes we put it away for like a month or a year at that point because it's too scary, and we hit that resistance. So making the small steps so small and doing them and leaving, what it starts to do is it gives your brain the message of, oh, okay, nothing bad is happening if I go down this path, actually. It's actually okay. And the steps can get a tiny bit bigger and a tiny bit bigger and a tiny bit bigger until before you know it, you're actually doing quite a bit that you wouldn't have done otherwise. Does that make sense?
Very good.
Yeah. Thank
kind
you.
of almost sneakily kind of get the flow going. Yeah.
Exactly. That's what we want to do. Because, and the other thing I will say is like that part of your brain it is not trying to be a jerk, it's just trying to protect you. And I think that's also important to remember, is that very often we have this, contentious relationship with our fear or our resistance. And the fact is that when we do that, we make things harder for ourselves. That fear is just trying to keep you safe. It really wants you to just live a nice, normal life. Why do you have to do this writing stuff? Why not, why not just relax and watch Netflix or do whatever you do, right? But because it wants to keep us safe is why it's doing it. It loves us. It's a kind thing. And if we can kind of befriend it in that way and give it a sense of, hey, okay, I get it. You want to keep me safe. I'm glad you're here. Thanks for that. Also, I'm just going to open the laptop. It's not a big deal. See, everything's fine. Backing away now. Yeah, so it is kind of sneaky, and it's also kind of fun to see how you can do it if you're watching it from almost like a, an external vantage point. How you can kind of watch yourself that way sometimes. When you do that, it's kind of a little bit fun to see, what can I do to trick the amygdala? And also to let it know that it is safe, actually, that I've got this. Nothing bad's going to happen. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much for the question.
I have a question. I have a problem of which I've been aware for a great many years. And I think of it as the problem of glibness. That is to say, writing comes almost too easily to me. So what I do is I write literary criticism. I also write poetry and things like that. And I can produce it so fast and it will suffice. But I have in me this suspicion or this hunch that, I'm lazy, and I think that if I took the trouble to imagine a better organized essay or a more coherent suite of poems, that sort of thing, that I could do it. Now, it may be that I can't, and that what suffices so far is enough. But I have this suspicion that I never can make myself do it. I don't know if I'm making that clear, but take the further step to imagine larger orders of organization and then shoot for them in my work. I have a very hard time doing that.
What is it that stops you?
Well, it's that problem that I think about as glib. There it is. I've written the thing, and it does what it was minimally supposed to do, and I'm too lazy to go back and I get it might be a problem here, to be specific, of revision.
Yeah.
Maybe that's to put a very practical word on it, that I'm bad at.
Is there fear? Then this is just totally my curiosity. I may be totally off base. Is there any fear in you that if you do put the time and effort into the revision, that it won't actually be as good as you think it could be? And so it's easier just to leave it as it is because it's good enough as it is. You're a smart guy, right? If you let it all out and you've got it and it's good as it is there any fear that, well, if I really put effort into making it what I think it could be, I might not reach that mark?
Yeah, I think there is. That would be a sort of a fear of incapacity on my part to realize something that I have never yet been able to realize.
Right.
So let's call it a fear for present purposes.
Okay. And then, so if you, well, I guess what I'm curious about is like, what is the part of you that drives the desire to do this. If you know that what you put out just kind of automatically is sufficient, what part of you wants to do additional revision and make it something more than it currently is?
Well, those are probably low motives like ambition and vanity. To be honest with you, when I search myself, actually, that's what I come up with.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of them as low motives. Perhaps I ought not. I don't know.
Yeah. Why would they be low motives? Why do you think of them as low motives?
Well, here we get into, I suppose, terrain, to take up a metaphor you used earlier. Mm-hmm. That is actually quite. It's like a moor or plain that extends through. It pervades me. I think that has to do with self-doubt and self-hatred, or the old Calvinistical sort of stuff, probably.
So, like, in terms of, a good person doesn't want to have this level of fame or ambition, or like to be seen in that sort of way. Is that what you mean?
It could be, or it's like, oh, what you fool, you idiot! How could you think you could possibly achieve that sort of thing? Just something like that. There's a little voice in my head that's always telling me that.
Yeah, it does sound like, so very, 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 very often these voices that we're hearing, they are programmed into us from a super early age in childhood. We can't even remember where they came from. Sometimes we can remember a teacher said something or a parent said something, but very often they are so deeply embedded in us that we can't even remember where they came from. And they are the voices that have been programmed to keep us safe. Because as a child, there's a lot that we don't know, right? We're kind of wandering through the world, being guided by adults. And we do internalize a lot of these ideas, specifically negative ones that adults give us, because negativity is usually a sign of danger, right? So very often we internalize these negative voices as indications of what is dangerous for us. And what we all want, as adults too, but especially as children who are dependent upon the people around us for survival, is to still be included as part of this group. And if we receive the message somewhere from some adult of, don't get too big for your britches, don't, do the stuff, don't stand out, don't do that stuff, it's dangerous for you to be too good, or it's dangerous for you to get up on a stage and make too much of yourself, that's embarrassing somehow, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe we have somewhere internalized those kinds of voices. They are pretty much universally those same voices that are trying to keep us safe as the ones that lead us to procrastinate. It's the same source, that source of fear of like, if I do this, I won't still be accepted by my group, whatever that is, whether it's your family or your class or whatever that group was. We need that group when we're children. And so we internalize these very specific, sometimes very specific ideas about what we're supposed to do and what we're not supposed to do. Does any of that resonate?
Yeah, I think it does. And thank you. You've given me a lot to think about. And I don't want to take any more.
Okay, yeah. Just one more thing before we move on. I just want to add that very often the things that in childhood that serve us almost as flotation devices that keep us safe, that we can like clamber up onto, and keep us safe, as we get older, begin to turn into an anchor and like drag us down. The same things that used to be life-saving and helpful. It's almost our job as adults to detach ourselves from these things and move to a place of, okay, now I can swim freely because I'm not a child anymore. I know how to swim. I can do these things. So the same things that I mentioned to the other Mark about, you know, moving through fear might be useful in this regard. Like if you had tiny, tiny, tiny steps like towards revision, what if you picked even one sentence and you were like, I'm just gonna like look at this one sentence and revise it, and I'm gonna leave the rest and see what happens if you do something like that.
Okay.
How does that sound?
That sounds fine. Thank you. I mean, that sounds very helpful.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks so much for the questions. Really, a really beautiful and interesting question. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mhm. Oh, yes. Hello. Hi, Jan.
Hi, Paige. I'd like to talk to you about how to stop being overwhelmed by information, and yeah, that's sort of where I'm coming from. My training is as an environmental scientist, and so I'm sort of spent 35 years, you know, looking at information and evidence and pulling it together. And one of my skills is synthesizing large amounts of material and getting messages from them. And so about 5 years ago, I started seriously researching the relationship between Japanese people and the elements, what we can learn from that, and the elements in the sense of physical elements and the Buddhist framework and the 5 Chinese phases. And I've pulled together an enormous amount of information. I'm overwhelmed by it, and I've tried sort of 4 different ways of presenting it, because you can present it from so many angles, like the seasons or Japanese traditions, like, you know, the tea ceremony and sumo, and, you know, everywhere you look basically. And I'm not sure how to get past it. No, just doing that exercise with the containers, like for possibly having to set a deadline to get something. I write a blog, so I have sort of been writing about my work, but it's only sort of individual aspects. It's how to bring it all together and present it in a interesting and an engaging way that is not scientific in the sense of science writing, but creative writing. So that's where I'm trying to get past that. It's a major block for me at the moment.
Yeah. So just to clarify, am I understanding correctly? Like you would like to take what you've already done in the blog and okay. And
no, I want to draw on that, but John Dougal did suggest maybe I could publish the blogs as a book in a sense, but I've looked at that and they weren't written for that purpose. So a lot of them are open-ended, and it's just, this is what I've learned so far, but I've got other things I'd like to sort of follow up, and some of them, you know, are not quite right because I wrote them 4 years ago or something and learned a lot since. So I had thought about doing that, but having looked at them all, I've decided that's not the way to go. It needs to be a separate book. And, you know, ideas I've had is just, you know, presenting what the elements are and what the, you know, as a very simple introduction, or really go into a lot of detail. So there's sort of in between those two, I guess.
yeah, I think what happens very often especially for writers, when we have so much information, it's very tempting. And we're also taught like this in school, right? We're taught like, well, you have to have an outline in an organization first. You have to know that first. And then you can slot what you have into that as, you know, a tool, as a container, right? An outline is its own kind of container, isn't it? And at the same time, it sounds to me like what you've got is just a lot of information there, almost like the image that's coming to me is of, you know, when you clean a closet or something and you just take everything out and you kind of dump it on the bed. You've got a lot of stuff, right? And from there, it's kind of like, okay, well, now what do I do? Is that accurate? That's kind of where you're feeling at the moment?
How do I feel? I just feel, I guess I hadn't thought of that analogy, so I'm just sort of trying to think if that works or not. But yeah, there's just too much there to deal with.
Well, I tend to, so one of the things that I think is so interesting about creativity that we don't talk about very often is how much it's driven by joy and pleasure. How much, like our original moto feeling of like why we want to do this is that it's fun. We like it. It makes us feel good. you know. And very often when we're in a place of overwhelm or we're in a place of stuckness, it's because we've lost that somehow.
Yeah.
We've lost that sense of like, what even feels good about this? Why did I want to do this? What am I even thinking? All that kind of stuff that can come up for us, right? Very often comes from having lost the fun of it. So what I would love to invite you to do would be to just feel into like, okay, you've got all this raw material. What in there feels like the most fun to you that you could possibly have when you kind of go into it and catch, like pulling a thread, the thing that's like the most fun of everything you've got. You can start to create, this kind of goes back to what I was saying about the outline. Like, you don't need an outline from the very beginning necessarily. You don't necessarily need a structure already in place. When you pull on the most joyful, wonderful, you know, like thing that you love from that raw material, you can start to build from that. Just that one little thing, that one little thread you pull will start to give you more of a material that you have, and more material in terms of writing. You can take it to the next step. Once you have done that again and again, you might find, oh, here's another thread I want to pull, and here's another, and here's another. And you'll begin to create, not unlike the blog posts, but maybe a bit less organized, you know, pieces or chunks. And as you do that, that is when the structure begins to emerge for you. For very, very, very many of us, we can't go into a book project already knowing what the structure is. It doesn't work like that for many of us. For some people it does. And I mean, I would love to be one of those people personally, but I'm not. It just seems like it would be a really satisfying way to be able to do it, but that's not how it works for many of us. So just creating the joyful bits and seeing from those joyful bits, okay, what's emerging in terms of theme, in terms of structure, and it may take a while. You know, it may take pulling on, I don't know, a dozen or more threads for that to start to happen. But if you allow it to be an intuitive process, it can feel much more fun and much more liberating to you than if you do want to, from the beginning, make it into, because really, I mean, it is 100% understandable that we all think I need an outline first, because that's what we're taught to do in school, isn't it? We're taught, you know, write it down, lay it out. That's how you do it. But with a creative project like this, very often it's just not how it works for us, and it can keep us stuck for a good long time.
I did have an outline right at the start, but yeah, it hasn't sort of, as I've learnt more and seen how complex and interconnected everything is, it sort of hasn't, I've moved away from that. So but yeah, I think also just the fear of putting something out there, you know, that's perhaps a bit new, or you know what will the Japanese academics think of it, which I shouldn't, you know, but all that sort of stuff. It's just so working through in steps, and the working for things that feel joyous is a good advice. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, I do think that, especially as writers, we do have the tendency to have like cart before horse syndrome, you know, like how's it going to be received and what are people going to think? That's a very common thing that we do. And it also does tend to like keep that same part of us in fear. That's a fear voice that's coming in and saying, just don't do it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So I think whatever is joyful for you sounds like a great next step. I'd love to hear how it goes.
Thank you very much.
Yes, Mike. Hello.
Hi. I'm fascinated by this notion of the amygdala and the behavioral impact it has on you and ways that you might be able to trick it. I'm wondering if you might suggest any reference books or anything like that that talk about this, you know, not necessarily at the neuroscience level, but at the behavioral level, that one could read to get more ideas about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm spacing on the exact name of the book, but it's called, I think it might be called The Kaizen Revolution or something like that.
Okay.
Kaizen is, as you probably know, a Japanese word that I think was originally instituted by Toyota as a method for keeping things very small and taking things little by little by little by little to make sure that we do things properly. Of course, that's what we want in the automotive industry, but also just in the Japanese way of like, you know, things, we want things to be done properly, right? And I may be wrong about that title, and I will check as soon as we're done here and make sure to get you the correct title. It's a small book, and it's a very, very interesting book to delve into this stuff, because it goes into the origin of the word Kaizen and how it impacts us in terms of our behavior, why it works, basically. It is incredibly powerful. And I think a big part of the reason it's so powerful is because we don't think it will be. You know, it seems silly. And it's even like to the point where you're like, there is just no way that's going to work. And that's why it works. You know?
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'll get that title to you for sure. Yes.
Thanks.
Okay, hi Paige. Yeah, thank you very much for all of your advice so far. And you've talked about advising people about memoirs, and you've also talked about writing about joyous threads. So can you give a little bit of advice how people could work with topics that are maybe not so joyous, that tie into the memoir and go into the bigger picture, and things that can't be avoided, and how to trick the amygdala to work on those aspects that may be holding us back?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Yeah. And it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because we all have those bits, especially when we're working with memoir, the parts that are less palatable to ourselves and to others. And I think very often, one thing I would say is if we do have something that's super, super sticky emotionally, to have the help of a therapist there, you know, just to have that in the background in case you need that, can be incredibly helpful, because a lot of this stuff that we're working with when we have, oh, thanks, Mark. Take care. Good luck on your next Zoom. Thank you. A lot of that stuff, that material can be very upsetting, to say the least, right? It can just get very sticky for us. So just to have that in the background as like care for, as almost like if you imagine yourself as a trapeze artist, to have that net below you, right? And a second thing that I would mention is that I really love the idea of creating our own narrative around what happened, in terms of making ourselves into not only like the first person narrator necessarily, but giving ourselves perspective on how we made it through that, the courage, the bravery, the fortitude that it took to get through that. When we look at who we are now, and we look at where we are in our lives, and we can see the line, the path that we took between those incredibly difficult things to kind of root down into our own sense of fortitude and courage, can very often give us a platform or a foundation on which to stand as we do that work. Who are you now? Because you're not that person who went through that anymore. I find it very, very helpful to ask myself this question anytime I'm about to do something that's going to be difficult for me. Who am I? What is true about me? What are my values? What are my skills? What have I done? You know, who am I as a human? When we get ourselves really solid and strong in that sense, it becomes a little easier to go into this tricky terrain and navigate it, because we have that rooted, solid sense of who we are. There's a book called Presence by Amy Cuddy, and she talks a lot about this, about getting into that place of who am I and what do I value, and from that place moving into the difficult thing. Does that resonate at all for you?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you too. What a great question. Oh, hi Adam.
Hi, Paige. Just as like counterpoint, just come back to the point you discussed earlier about procrastination and perfectionism. Yeah. I think that there's something to be said for wanting to strive for perfection as well. And I think that the challenge that I have with writing is that you lose objectivity over your own work as you're writing. Mm-hmm. Like you get this tunnel vision mentality where you've got to finish something, and then you finish it, and you take a step back from it, and you come back to it later, and you're like, oh, that was not quite what I intended to write or something. And so one of the challenges that I find is coming back to a piece of work later and finding that it's very different to my expectations. Mm-hmm. You maintain objectivity over your work. How do you take a step back and get distance? Does it come back to like changing your environment and things like that? Do you have any advice on that?
It's a great question. Yeah. I think that in many ways it's very difficult to do, isn't it? Because just the same way we can't edit our writing for typos, like because we know what it's supposed to say, it's really hard to catch typos in your own writing, isn't it? It's the same kind of thing with any other standard that we're holding ourselves to. One thing that really helps is time, if you've got it. If you can take some time away, do something else, however long that might be, really get your brain into something else. And as you have the time away, you can come back and look at it with a different set of eyes. I also find it really helpful to have like this, a group, or even just one writing partner who you really trust. So you, especially if that person has a similar set of standards to you, and you feel like, okay, I really respect this person. I respect the quality of their work. I respect how they think about writing. Having even one other person to do that with you can be extraordinarily helpful. And I think another thing that we can do also is to put it to a different kind of test internally. Like if you kind of imagine yourself, it's almost like you could even do this physically, like take the work somewhere else and imagine that you are someone else, like kind of put yourself in a character. If I was the editor of whatever place, or if I was this person, like, and I'm reading it with those eyes, what would I think from that point of view? You can give yourself like a different stance on it. That's not yourself, if that makes sense, kind of playing a role and looking at it from that point of view. So those are 3 things I might suggest. Do any of those sound helpful to you?
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you too. Thank you all so much for your amazing questions. I've just loved talking to you. And oh, hi, Lisa came on. Did you have something?
I've been on the whole time. I apologize for being with my camera off, but my computer's in the middle of my living room, and people have been walking behind me the whole time, and dogs have been barking. So I've been with the camera off with mute. And I've also, my dad, I told him not to call while I was this. And of course he called, and now I have my son talking to him in the other room. So I've missed a few things, but I know it's being recorded. So apologies if someone's already asked this question before, well, in the time when I was talking to my dad in the other room. But I'm always looking for ideas. I know what works for me really well, but I'm always looking for other ideas for things that work. In your experience, what is the most uncommon, weirdest, or surprising thing that someone has said worked for them?
Oh, it's such a great question. That's a great question.
I know you speak to a lot of people about this.
I do. Well, it depends on the genre, like the type of work. I work with a lot of people across different artistic disciplines. So sometimes, for example, when I'm working with a visual artist, they'll talk about just, they're doing a painting, they just completely turn it upside down. Or they talk about, even one person talked about, I left the studio and I took off all my clothes and I went back in and somehow being unguarded in that way felt different. Like I could look at the painting in a different way. So that I think is really interesting, even metaphorically, like how could we do that with our work? Could you get naked and look at it? I don't know. But one thing that I also really love in terms of writing, and actually kind of plays into what I was just saying to Adam, a client of mine recently started telling me about, she has a niece who lives on a different continent. She's here in Japan, and the niece lives in Canada. And she told me that, she felt, because her niece is like a teenager, that she couldn't directly address her niece in the way she kind of wanted to. So she took on a character and she made herself into this character and pretended that they were in like the 19th century and started writing letters to her from this perspective, as if, you know, they were like fancy ladies in the 19th century. And I thought that was so inventive and so interesting as a way to just kind of remove yourself and all of those kind of blocks to, because when we are in our own sense of like who I am, right? I know who I am. I'm so clear on that, especially as we get older, it can get stifling, can't it? It's just like, okay, I'm a little bit tired of myself and that voice, you know? So I really loved this idea of bringing in this whole other character and then having it be almost like a play between them. So yeah, I wonder if there isn't a way to use that in writing in general, if we could even just write from a different character's perspective, if we could, even if we're writing nonfiction, to write from the perspective of someone else who might be looking at it, could be interesting. What do you think about that?
Also useful in job interviews.
Yes, very much so.
I asked of somebody who I consider a mentor. I said, well, I'm going to go into this interview next week. And then all the people there just say, just be yourself. And he said, oh, no, that's terrible advice. You have to be someone else. Let's think about who you have to be. Let's.
Yeah.
It's like when you work there a while and you're steady in the job, then you can be yourself.
Let that flag fly once they know you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Is there anything else?
Turn it off because somebody's coming. I hear
Okay,
the door.
no problem. No problem. Yes, Kirsty. Oh, you're just saying, okay, got it. Okay. Well, before we wrap up, I would love to tell you all about a few things that I have available that might be useful to you as tools or containers. One thing that I do have is on Monday mornings at 8:30, from 8:30 to 9:30, I have what is called co-creation time. And co-creation time is a video call where we get on and we basically, people from all over the world come in and we say hello to each other and we talk about what we're going to be doing that day. And then we mute our mics and we work all at the same time. It's just a co-working time, basically, but people are doing all kinds of things. There's people doing illustration, people doing coding, software coding, people doing, I've had people doing woodworking, etching, printmaking, just all kinds of stuff, music, and of course, writing. And so I do that every Monday from 8:30 to 9:30. We do that section of working, and then we come back for a few minutes at the end to just kind of check in and see what everybody's been doing and how it's gone. And I find that to be really valuable in terms of like just having a time to work. If you know that you're going to want to be working on something and you want a little chunk of time, it's a really useful thing also just to have that community around it, other creative people doing things at the same time. There's like a really cool energy that comes with that. I also have an Instagram account, which I think I mentioned at the beginning. If you're on Instagram and you would like to see, I have pretty much daily content, although pretty soon I'm going to be taking Natsuyasumi, a little bit of a break for Natsuyasumi because my kids will be off of school, but you could also follow me there if you want to. My name there is Whole Self Creative, WHOLE Self Creative on Instagram. And I also do offer coaching sessions one-on-one to clients. I've worked with people from all over the world, and basically how I do it is there's a 12-second session package, and we work together on figuring out what your own creative needs are and how to navigate your own creative terrain in very specific ways. And then we work through it together. It's often very helpful for people, especially if they're working on a specific project. Even if not, it's also quite helpful. And then starting in September, I'm going to be doing a group coaching offering. And I don't have details about that just yet, but the group coaching, it costs a little less than the one-on-one coaching. And it's also a nice little opportunity to have a small community and work together on various things. So if you would like to know more about that, you can also sign up for my, mailing list on my website, which is www.wholeselfcreative.com. So I just wanted to share that with all of you in case you wanted to know more about my work or wanted to work together in some capacity. At co-creation time, I forgot to mention, is totally free. It doesn't cost anything. So you're welcome to join anytime you like, and you can sign up for that on my website. There's an events tab. If you go to my website and find the events tab, you can sign up for co-creation time there anytime. I do it every week. So any of you are welcome, and I would love to have you at any point. So yeah, thank you all so much. I've really loved being here. It's a pleasure to see and be with other people who have this connection to Japan and who I haven't met before. It's just been lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paige.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, I think everyone got a lot out of today. It was wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Everyone for making the time.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Mike, I will find that title and I'll email it to Kirsty and maybe she can send it on to you.
Yeah.
Okay,
I'll
great.
send it,
That'd be fun, fantastic.
Okay, I'll probably put it on the Facebook page. Is that all right?
Yeah, that's great. Any place like that's great.
Okay. All right, I'll do that.
Thank
you
you.
all so much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Paige.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a great day.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye.